Welcome to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts podcast. We are so happy to have all of you with us today.
Yes, I'm excited to be here, excited for this episode. It's going to be a fun one. But before we get into that, I just wanted to let people know that the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery is offering spring support groups. So if you have been looking for a group to be a part of navigating, deconstruction or religious trauma or any of the things that go along with that, we host support groups twice a year in the spring and the fall. And so our spring ones are starting. So you can head to the show notes to grab the link for that. You can go to our website, traumaresolutionrecovery.com, and there's a little services tab where you can hit support groups, or you can head to our Instagram page, Trauma Resolution and Recovery, and you can find out more about the support groups there. But would definitely encourage people to get involved if that is something you are interested in. I've been able to lead support groups in the past. I've been a part of the support groups in the past. And there's just something really special about being able to be surrounded by other people that have gone through similar paths and are on the same journey of healing, and being able to hear stories and support one another and also really feel connected in the process. So I'm all for it. So yeah, make sure to head over and take a look at those groups.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yes. I think it's great that we are able to offer those.
Mm.
And today, really excited about our guest today as well. So We're having Ashley Buckner. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist. She'll be on the podcast with us today. We'll be talking all things purity culture, also LDS purity culture specifically. Mm-hmm. Really excited for this conversation.
Yeah, I'm really excited too. Ashley and I have been friends for a little while now. I love that she agreed to do these episodes. We're doing a 2-part episode with Ashley, and this first part, we're going to be talking a little bit more about her own personal story inside purity culture and the LDS church and some of how she healed. And then next week, we'll talk a little bit more about some of those unique pieces, purity culture within the Mormon church and how to heal. And so I just think this is a really great conversation. Also because, we've had a lot of listener stories that have been submitted this year about LDS purity culture and the impacts of it. And so I love that we're going to have an actual person he's in Utah, working with ex-LDS people through, healing through religious trauma. And I'm just excited for the conversation that we have. She was a great guest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, before we get into the interview, I just always want to leave our quick disclaimer, and we recognize that some of the topics we discuss in any episode may bring up feelings, emotions, and triggers that may require more processing or be too much to handle right now. Please always feel free to skip any episode or parts of episodes and come back if and when you are ready. Our goal is to help you trust your own body and lived experience, so take what you need and leave what you don't. So now it is time for listener stories. We asked our listeners some questions, and one of those was, what was the moment when you realized purity culture's teachings were harmful or false? And one of our listeners says, when my serious boyfriend, now husband, and I were making out, and after I briefly felt him up downstairs, pretty sure it was even over the pants, I unexpectedly started sobbing. It felt terrifying because I didn't feel in control of what was a deeply somatic reaction. I realized a lot of work would need to be done to undo the impact of purity culture. 5 years later, I'm still in the work and have a long way to go. Grateful for the progress, but I'm also oftentimes discouraged. I can't undo all of it.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm grateful for this story. That I think that feels common just in terms of like that really prolonged guilt feeling, either from what I quote unquote did back then, or how that guilt and fundamentalist messaging can live in your body even, years and decades after having left. Gosh, I think this is I see this with my clients all the time, that confusion of, I've left this, like purity culture is not something I believe in, and yet my body is having these responses still. And I'm even in the quote unquote right kind of relationship. I'm married, all these things. And purity culture is just so deeply impactful. And it really is like so much to untangle the impact of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is. I mean, I think it's even just realizing that was a deeply somatic reaction, and even articulating it. I mean, that I really do just appreciate even just that recognition, because that's really how this stuff lives in our bodies. Like, it's not just an emotional thing. It's a physiological thing. And yeah, it takes time. I guess really my biggest takeaway is just, just have a lot of self-compassion. I mean, not trying to make a principle or out of it taking forever. I don't want to say that either, but also it does take time. It truly does.
It does. Yep. Yep. It does. It does. So thank you for sharing that. All right. It is time for some listener questions. And our first one is, how is purity culture different from just teaching values or morality? I've heard this asked many times before. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I've never heard it framed quite like that. So let me think about that. I mean, my thought is, my initial thought, not having like really flushed it out too much, is because values and morality could refer to anything. It's just belief systems, whatever that might be. The thing that with purity culture that makes it what it is the fact that it is so high control. It is, that's part of what I think makes it problematic is, because you can have values and morality that aren't inherently part of purity culture, though purity culture is a type of value system, yes, but it's one that I think tends to strip people of their own autonomy and agency and is prescriptive of what you should do to be okay, and that's one thought I have. So what about you?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think you can have your own values and your own set of morals that are independent of purity culture. I think a way that I've been asked this in the past is like, purity culture is just like, don't have sex before you're married. Like, why is that so bad? And I've always said, like, I could actually care less when you have sex, so long as it's consensual and, all of those things. And if that happens to be before you're married or after you're married or whatever, like that is a personal decision. And hopefully that decision is arising from your own values, your own morals, independent of like fear of consequences of what would happen. So am I not engaging in sexual activity because, I'm afraid that's going to make me dirty and my future spouse will never come around because of that, or I'm scared of being kicked out of the community or my eternal salvation or whatever that is. Like that, making decisions and having values based off of like this fear of consequence is that recipe for power and control. So when we think about purity culture different from just, from values or morality, I feel like that's coming from this sense of self of like what is right for me and what is what is important and valuable to me and how am I living that out. So certainly purity culture could be a set of values or morality, but also that's very different. It's not one and the same. Yeah. And I also think too, like purity culture is so dictated by external sources where when we think about values and morality, hopefully that would come from this intrinsic values and knowing yourself and what's important to you, not just because somebody on the outside of me says this is what I'm supposed to do in order to be good or right or pure.
Yeah, no, I think I agree.
Yeah. Interesting. Good question.
Okay, this will be a good one. I experience intense shame after sex, even with a loving partner. How do I break that cycle?
This is a little bit like the listener story that we had earlier in this episode. I think, first of all, I just want to normalize that I think it is unfortunately common, but it is common. In terms of, that intense shame after sex, I think when it comes to shame, it has such a similar physiological kind of pattern as trauma does. Like how trauma lives in our body is very similar to how shame lives in our body. So I'm inclined to say that we need to start to do some nervous system work and understanding what's happening when we're engaging in these sexual experiences. Am I present? Am I dissociating? Do I feel like I'm in my body? And maybe getting curious around that and then looking for ways to become embodied. Yeah, I know we've talked about this on other episodes too, like stepping into desire and pleasure in non-sexual ways, like slowly titrating into being embodied and experiencing pleasure and things like that aren't necessarily having to do with sex, but ultimately, could include sex and that sort of thing. And so I'm inclined to say, get curious about what is actually happening, like be honest with, am I actually present in my body during these experiences, or is there something else happening? And, can I start to lean into non-sexual pleasure? And that literally could be like, is there a scent that I enjoy smelling? Is there a type of clothing fabric that feels really good on my body? And leaning into pleasure, leaning into, what feels good in these non-sexual ways and kind of expanding your capacity that way to experience pleasure, to experience being present in any moment, to be embodied, and let that grow and see if we can then use that as a way to then start to slowly engage in sexual experiences. And that doesn't just mean having sexual intercourse. That could mean holding hands with somebody. It could mean, making out with somebody and just seeing, like, can I stay present? Can I stay enjoying this and see if we can expand our capacity for that. And the reason I go about it that way instead of just saying, like, don't feel shame or whatever, that just doesn't work. But oftentimes we have to, like, in order to decrease the shame, we have to have another embodied experience to replace that. We have to have other tools and resources. And so that if and when that shame starts to creep up, we have some other coping mechanisms and internal safety that we can lean on in those moments. But what do you think, Andrew?
I agree with that. I mean, what you were saying about shame and trauma kind of being similar in how they show up. I was actually just thinking of, there's this chart that I have related to polyvagal theory, and just recognizing how it conceptualizes shame oftentimes as being dorsal shutdown, which is where it's a survival response or trauma response, which what a lot of folks call it, but it's a nervous system response to distress. It's just the difference between like fight or flight rather than hyper arousal. It's hypo arousal. It's kind of almost a shutdown. And that is usually oftentimes how shame shows up, especially when it's shame that is something inherent to our bodies and our physicality and our sexuality. And so I do think that absolutely tracks. And I also agree, what we've said before, finding other ways to explore pleasure, not sexual pleasure, but just in the most general sense, like a favorite flavor of ice cream, music that you like, blankets, a weighted blanket, different things like that. Those are all different things that your senses as a human being can experience. And some things are more pleasurable than others. And so just, titrating it, starting small, incrementally, starting with things that don't have anything to do with sex to start with, and slowly working into that. So, how do I break that cycle? I mean, it's a very short and simple question. And unfortunately, it's not a short and simple answer, but there is absolutely a way forward.
Good questions. Ashley Buckner is a licensed marriage and family therapist and certified brainspotting practitioner. Raised in an unorthodox Mormon community and survivor of childhood sexual abuse, Ashley specializes in helping people understand the impact of purity culture, especially on childhood sexual abuse survivors.
Through her own journey of leaving religion and finding healing in community and body-based therapy, she supports clients navigating similar experiences. Ashley's work emphasizes that healing is possible and focuses on trauma-informed care that integrates mind and body.
Welcome to the Sunday School Dropouts podcast, Ashley. It is so awesome to have you here. First-time guest, and I think this is going to be such an awesome conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I love the work you guys do.
Yes. Well, I'm excited for this conversation because I think you might be the first ex-Mormon therapist that we have had on the podcast. But as you know, we've been doing this, purity culture has been our entire third season. We have received so many listener stories from former LDS people, just sharing their purity culture experiences. And I mean, they're so similar to all the other, denominations of churches, but also somehow worse, I feel like. So, so I'm excited to dig into it. And just for our listeners, Ashley is going to be here for 2 episodes. I'm so excited. This part of the episode, we are going to be talking more about Ashley's personal story and that, purity culture, leaving Mormonism, things like that. And then in the second episode that we're doing with Ashley, she is going to be putting her therapist hat on, and we're going to be talking more about particularities of Mormonism and purity culture, healing, all that fun stuff. But for today, we'll start with the personal stuff. And Ashley, I just wonder if you can share with our audience a little bit, just kind of an overview of the religious world that you grew up in, kind of what did unorthodox Mormonism look like in your home and your community?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did grow up in an unorthodox Mormon home. And what that means is my mom was a member of the church, but my dad was not a member of the church for the first 10 years of my life. So I also grew up in small town Utah, a little town called Cedar City in the southern part of the state. And I think small towns have their own flavor in and of themselves. And then you add in the element of high control religion, and Mormonism is obviously the most predominant religion in Utah. So that was very much a part of my life. My mom's side of the family is Mormon ancestors. My great grandpa helped settle and homestead southern Utah. So I have that Mormon pioneer blood in my being. And then my dad is actually an Italian Catholic, and he's from Northern California, but he landed in Utah with his family, and that's how he met my mom. And so I think my story begins even before I was ever born. My mom was 3 months pregnant with me when they got married. And my mom grew up Mormon, but my grandparents, although they grew up with that Mormon lineage, they were like your Jack Mormons, right? Where they didn't follow the rule. That's like the phrase we use here, where they didn't follow the rules. But my grandma to this day still very much believes in the church, even though I don't know the last time she went to church. I don't know the last time she went through the temple. She drinks, she smokes, right? Does all the things you're not supposed to. But my grandma is very much, she's going to be buried in her Mormon like clothing.
Oh, interesting.
Which is so fascinating.
Yeah.
So my mom kind of, I think, grew up similar to me in the sense that my mom really wanted to belong. She really wanted to be seen in this community. And so then when she got pregnant before she was married, she had a lot of shame. And my dad was not going to get married. Right.
Okay. Yes.
So they were young. They were 20. She was 20 when she got pregnant. He was only 20. They ended up getting married. And then she had me when she was 20, just turned 21 years old.
Wow.
20. She just almost 21. Yeah. So she was so young. And I think that shame was already like, I was born feeling ashamed, if that makes sense. And so my earliest memories of going to church were wanting my family to be like all of the other families there. And I'm the oldest. I have 2 younger brothers, and it's so fascinating because they don't have the same level of religious trauma that I do.
Wow. Yeah.
But they were also born into a completely different family, right?
That's true.
And different dynamics. So I grew up going to church knowing that my family was different because my dad was not a member. And in the Mormon church, that's really significant because the Mormon church believes that the priesthood holder is essential for the family. And the only way you can all be together in heaven is if your parents are both worthy members and they're married in the temple. So already I was less than, and I actually didn't connect these dots until later on in life and doing my own deconstruction. But I was a really scared kid, and I was terrified of death and dying. I was like, anything would make me really scared to die. And I had a lot of anxiety and distress around that. And now in hindsight, it makes so much sense because if I died, we weren't going to be together forever, right?
Yes.
And so I kind of grew up very in and out. So Sundays, we would go to church sometimes on Sundays, and sometimes my dad would come, sometimes he wouldn't. But we also spent a lot of Sundays up at my cabin in the mountains, like an hour away from where I grew up. So I had this really unique upbringing of Sundays weren't like how Sundays are for a lot of Latter-day Saints, where you don't miss church and you have to keep the Sabbath day holy. We didn't ever embody that. So that was fascinating. But when I was 10, my dad got baptized. And I didn't know this at the time. I learned this later on in life. But he will say the only reason he got baptized was for me. So he wasn't a believer, but I wanted him. And I don't remember this, but I can like understand where it came from. Like I wanted my dad to be a member of this church so we could be this perfect Mormon family. So he got baptized when I was 10. Which was fascinating.
Yeah.
No, that's just so interesting. And I was not expecting you to say that your dad was Catholic. When you were leading into the story, I'm like, oh, that's not what I was expecting at all. I'm actually really curious. This is not one of the questions, but I am so curious about this. Like, how is that handled? So when your parents got pregnant, but your dad's Catholic, so because I know some churches will handle it like, well, the best you can do is to go ahead and get married because you should have been married anyway, that whole narrative. But I realize, well, in the LDS church, it's so much bigger of a deal given that, well, he wasn't a member, and so like, was marriage encouraged, or was that a big scandal, and was it discouraged? That's what I'm curious about.
I think it was absolutely encouraged on my mom's end. I've actually never asked my dad's mom about this part of the story. My dad's dad passed away when he was like 12, so I never knew my paternal grandfather. So I don't think there was really a big family conversation either on that side. I just am remembering this, my memories being jotted. My mom was told when she was in high school that she couldn't have kids. And so
Oh.
she wasn't being careful. And my mom has told me, because she got pregnant, she went to California to live with my dad for the summer because that's where my grandmother was at the time. And my mom's mom said to her, I want you to go get pregnant. So like my grandma and grandpa were so like, go get pregnant so you can get married and like do this thing. So I
Wow.
don't think my mom felt a lot of shame or pressure from her family per se. I think it was more from the community. She did not want
Mm.
anyone to know she was pregnant at her wedding, and you couldn't tell. I mean, she was tiny, only 3 months pregnant. But I think my grandma, on my paternal grandma, had probably a lot of different feelings, and she had a lot of big feelings about my dad getting baptized. And her and I have since had some conversations because she said to him when he was baptized in the Mormon church, you know, you're already baptized. Because my grandma's very Catholic. Like I've gone to Catholic mass several times. Like my dad's side of the family was very Catholic, but so she was not happy with his decision to get baptized. But he did it. He said, "Mom, I'm doing it for Ashley." That's what he told her.
Wow. Wow, that feels like so much pressure. Like, you know, I mean, for a kid, but even for an adult to like put that on you and to say like, the only reason I'm doing this is because of you. How did that impact you?
Well, so again, I didn't realize this at the time, but when he told me later on in life, I was like, what are you talking about, Dad? I was 10. I was 10 years old, but unfortunately, I think given trauma and life experiences, there is and my parents had me when they were 20 years old, there's a level of emotional immaturity. So I genuinely think that is exactly why he did it. And he still would, to this day, stand behind it. He never believed. But I think that it made sense of some of my internal struggles after he got baptized. So I remember I have this very vivid memory. My mom was gone and we were doing family home evening. So Monday nights, right, in the Mormon church, they do like a church lesson and a prayer. And I don't even know if we had a church lesson, but my dad, who I'd never heard pray, volunteered to do the prayer. And I have 2 younger brothers. And I remember my dad started praying and both my brothers started giggling. They thought it was funny because they'd never seen him pray. And my dad got so angry. Like he lost it because I think he was embarrassed. I mean, who knows what? He has a lot of shame. But I took that so hard and I felt so protective of my brothers. To this day, I have this and I've recently shared it with them and they're like, we don't even remember that, Ash. What are you talking about? But I took it so seriously. And then I was like, okay, well, it makes sense if I had pushed so hard for my dad to get baptized and I was so excited for him to get baptized. And now he says this prayer and he's really vulnerable and then he gets made fun of for it, then it's my fault, you know? And I think from a young age, I internalized everything, especially as the oldest daughter, and blamed myself for everything. So my parents' inability to be good Mormons was a reflection of me growing up.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Which I feel like is so common from parents to children, right? Like that's how they view like, have I done an okay enough job? But yeah, that is so interesting that it was almost reverse, like, which I kind of resonate with that. And I mean, my parents were very religious also, but like, I remember other spiritual leaders telling me, like, we need to be your spiritual authorities because we don't think that your parents can be that for you. And just taking that so seriously and being like, wow, I am even having to be more spiritually mature than they are, and like having to pull them along and, you know, kind of get them into their faith even more. I mean, I remember having theological discussions and I'm like, oh man, now, like, you know, having to convince them, you know, trying to convince them. So it is so much pressure to have on you.
Absolutely. And that was very real also. I think I felt that from a lot of leaders and people in my church. And so although my parents, and then after my dad got baptized, my parents went through the LDS temple and we were sealed as a family. And when you do it after you have kids, there's a part of the temple ceremony that the children can attend. So I do have a memory of going to the LDS temple specifically for that. And all I remember is me and my brothers walked into this room and all the people are dressed in their like garb, you know, all the clothing that they wear. And it's almost like there's like this energy and this pressure, like this is a spiritual experience. You have to be emotional and cry. So I remember crying, but it was also just really bizarre and this really bizarre thing that we did. And then my parents were married in the temple and they wore their garments, but then they didn't, it's not like my dad followed the rules. My dad wasn't even a true believer.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know? So fast forward to my freshman year of high school, we go on a family cruise with a bunch of families from my town. Some are members of the church, some aren't. And my parents are drinking on this cruise. And I was at a table with a family that I was close with at the time. And my parents were at another table. And the dad of that family, I was sitting next to him. And I'll never forget this. He leaned over and talking about my own parents, he said, "You never want to act like that. You never want to do what they're doing." And I remember feeling so icky. Like, I remember feeling ashamed of my parents, but also like, this is a huge boundary violation, you know? So there was so much of that, like, that I needed to be better than my parents, for sure.
Oh gosh, so much pressure.
Wow.
But I loved my parents so much, you know?
Right,
like, that's what you do as a kid. You love your parents.
Yeah. Well, and you also like, I mean, basic, you know, child developmental psychology is like, you cannot conceptualize that your parents would be human even, right? Let alone maybe make mistakes or whatnot. And so, yeah, I mean, it's like even naturally in something you internalize on top of these spiritual things then that are being like directly told to you, which is just, I feel like that can just mess with a kid so much. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. No, just you describing that, like, it just reminds me of stuff, similar anecdotes, like even from my background in Adventism, and it's just like, wow, like the weight that must have been, like basically taking on this parentified role with your parents, essentially, you know? Like,
Yeah. And you're being taught to judge your parents, which, you know, and which is honestly really on brand for the culture. And also too, you want to be a part of this community. Like, I want to be a good Mormon. I want to embody that. That was something I feel like I tried and failed at the entire time I was a member of the church, to be honest with you.
The subject matter of the entire season, we're doing purity culture, like from all different angles. And I don't think we've had a chance to really talk about it from the LDS background yet. And so I'm just curious for you, like what were some of the core messages that you did receive about sex, the body, obedience, all of that, whether it was explicitly said or just, you know, implied?
Absolutely. And for me, I think this is like, this is probably a little bit unique to me in Mormon culture and maybe doesn't apply to everyone who grew up in Mormon culture. Because my parents got pregnant with me, sex was always like kind of talked about in the sense of like, we know you're going to have sex and so you'll just get on birth control. That's all it was really talked about. It wasn't like discussed about what it meant or what you were getting into, or I didn't learn to understand my body at all. But I think that was really confusing because it was like, okay, well, you're going to have sex. But then I'm going to a church that says you're not going to have sex and you shouldn't have sex. If you have sex before you're married, you need to repent and it's a sin. But then my parents are not necessarily saying that. So it was really confusing for me as a child. But I was also I experienced sexual abuse when I was 4 years old from it was from my mom's brother, an uncle of mine, and he was 12 or 13 at the time. And I think it was very much like the unsupervised nature that comes with Mormon culture, his own like upbringing in purity culture also. And so I think I was also very sexual at a young age. Like, I remember playing with my Barbie dolls as a little girl and they were doing sexual things, but I was doing it very hidden in my room. And I was always like wanting a boyfriend. I was always super curious about kissing. And, you know, then once I hit puberty, I was curious about other things. So I was a part of this culture that was like, you're not supposed to have sex. My parents are like, we don't want you to have sex, but you're going to have sex. And then I wanted to have sex or do sexual things. So it was just really kind of a clusterfuck, to be honest with you. And I think from that early trauma, I already had so much shame. And then I think when you have experienced sexual abuse and you grow up in a purity culture that is also abusive and you're receiving messages that these things make you less than, and you're already kind of exploring those things at a young age in your play, I just grew up hating myself in terms of my sexuality and my body. Like that was,
Mhm.
I would say, if I think about the way Mormonism impacted me the most, it was the purity element and that whole scenario.
Yeah.
I don't know if that
Mm.
answered your question. Did I answer your
No,
question?
I think
Yeah,
so.
no, absolutely.
Yeah, and I know we'll talk about. I definitely want to go into the childhood sexual abuse thing in just a moment. But I wonder, as you're talking about like the purity piece of Mormonism, like what were some of those messages that were emphasized outside of like obviously you don't have sex before you're married because that was a very different message
Yeah.
that you were getting. But what else, when you say purity culture impacted you the most, what were some of those things?
I mean, it was like anything sexual. So it was touching, masturbation, heavy petting, like
Mm-hmm.
really it was like you can kiss a boy and that was it. Like that was the
Mm-hmm.
only thing that was allowed. But if it went more than that, which encompasses, I think, a lot of things, right? Like you're
Yeah.
passionately making out, you're like maybe getting like you're fondling each other, like which I started doing when I was like in 8th grade. And
Yeah.
and you were not allowed to do anything. I don't think I even knew what masturbation was
Yeah.
until I was older. Like I never had
Yeah.
even
Mm.
learned about that. I hadn't, and also too, we had like nicknames for our body parts. So like I didn't
Mm-hmm.
ever call my vagina a vagina until I was an adult. That's so rooted in my mom's side of the family. Like my mom can't even say the word vagina. My grandma
Mm-hmm.
for sure can't. So I think the the whole idea is like you don't talk about sex, and not even just sex, you don't talk about anything related to your body and getting
Mm-hmm.
turned on. So it's like a complete lack of education.
Yeah.
And that, like when I think about Mormon purity culture, there's no education to your body. It's like you
Mm-hmm.
just don't do
Mm.
any of those things and you just turn it off
Yeah.
and you move on, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there any emotional components too? Because I mean, I just remember like for as I think about purity culture, it like becomes more and more and more restrictive and oppression, like oppressive. And, so it starts off with like, don't have sex before you get married. And then you just kind of keep taking things away to the point where it's like you have to also keep your heart pure. You can't give your heart away. You can't, you shouldn't say I love you to anybody other than your spouse. You have to guard your heart and make sure you don't get emotionally attached to people that aren't going to be your future spouse. Was there some of those components that were involved also, or is that a little bit different in the LDS faith?
I never remember feeling that at all. And I don't
Mhm.
remember receiving messages like that. I also think because there's such a big emphasis on marriage and finding your eternal partner that it's almost like encouraged to
Mm.
fall in love and be in love and get married and do all of that, right? Like I did very specific activities in young women's in church and they were my favorite ones. We tried on wedding dresses and I was like, this is the best day ever. And I was 12 years old, but I couldn't wait to get married
Mm.
because that was my divine purpose. So I think it was easy to have a lot of boyfriends because of that. And I never
Gotcha.
felt guarded in that way. That's a
That's
great
so
question, though.
interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So encouragement of dating. But it wasn't
Yeah.
like if you started dating somebody, say like in high school, was it just kind of assumed that's probably who you're going to marry?
I think there was a little bit of that. So there was also this interest. I don't know if it's like an actual doctrine rule, but this kind of collective rule that you can't date till you're 16 years old. And I remember my
Mm.
parents kind of embodying that.
Okay.
And so a lot of girls were not allowed to go to high school dances, but then I was. I was allowed to go to dances. But
Interesting.
when I remember I had a crush on this boy. I was like 10 or 11 years old, and he's 3 years older than me. And I remember at that age saying, I'm going to marry him. That's who I'm going to
Mm.
marry. And then my freshman year of high school, I started dating him, and he was a senior in high school. And we very much talked about marriage all the time.
Mhm.
And I would say other guys I dated in high school after that relationship, I did not talk about marriage a lot, but I think it was always kind of there in the back of my mind. Like, this could be someone you're going to marry for sure.
Yeah,
Mm.
like that assumed expectation, even if it wasn't, explicit. That's so interesting. I resonate with that. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. No, that's so interesting. I also wanted to return to the thread you mentioned. I know you mentioned a few moments ago about the childhood sexual abuse, and I appreciate you being willing to
Yeah.
share and speak to that. Also, I want to preface all of this. Only speak to what you're comfortable sharing, certainly. But I would like to hear just more about that. But specifically, how purity culture just impacted the way you were able to process that and able to process what happened and purity culture, but specifically, from a Mormon background as well.
Absolutely. I've done a lot of nervous system work on the
Mhm.
sexual abuse. Actually, it's something I've
Mm.
worked through quite a bit, which is why I also have a lot of language for it. So when it happened, I was with my cousin, who's my other female cousin, who's like a year younger than me. And so it happened to both of us. And then I don't know the time frame, right? But the next day, or in my mind, the next day, her mom came to my house, and I remember it was my aunt came, ran me upstairs to the bathroom, and she was like, "Did he touch you? Did he touch you?" And I knew to say no. Like, I knew that it was bad, right? So I was like
Mm.
4 years old, and I knew it was bad. So then I kept that a secret. I never told the truth about it until I was 20 years old, and I would say I never told the truth about it because of growing up in Mormon purity culture, right? Being told that this was a sin and that this is not something that should ever happen. And also, he was my uncle and someone I was close with. Like, I would see him after that, and nothing ever happened again, but I had a relationship with him. I would go to my grandma's house and play games with him, and so we were never left alone with him again. But in a lot of ways, I think it's like, did it really happen? Was it real? And also, no one ever talked to me about it. My mom would bring it up, and my mom would say, "Yeah, this is like, we don't leave 13-year-olds alone with girls because like this can happen and it happens a lot. And they said that so and so did it to you," and I would never tell the truth. Like, I would never say it out loud. She would give me every opportunity and I would never say it. And I think it was because I had just learned that sex was bad, or sexual things were bad, touching was bad, and in a lot of ways it was my fault, you know. And I think that really stunted me into like acknowledging what had happened. And I would say the way it impacted me the most, though, is because I think it turned on my sexual desire at a very young age. So then what would happen? I would get myself into precarious situations with boys where I would do things that like I thought I wanted to do, and then I would be like, well, I shouldn't have done that, but it felt really good and I liked it. And that was like my spiral from the time I was in 8th grade until, honestly, until I graduated college. Fortunately, I might have been like 21 when I told my best friend in college about it, and she was like, "Ash, that's not okay. That can't happen, and you need to call your mom." And I called my mom and told my mom, and my mom could not like hold it. And so then I think I was like really impacted by her own purity culture too, and her own sexual trauma. I think a very similar thing happened to her when she was a little girl, right? Like, that's just like generationally how it's always been. So I think it impacted my ability to have language for what had happened.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because it's not easy in any situation, but then you add all these other things on top of it, like the shame and generational pieces and religion. And it just is this like big pot of like grossness that really just shames and silences victims, and takes you decades even to be able to just say, yes, it happened, let alone all the other healing that goes with it. It's just so devastating. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. So you had said when you were young, when it happened, like the day after, right? So you're 4 years old, you knew that you were not supposed to talk about it. I wonder, can you, like, looking back now, what do you think of that? How did you know that?
So like, I'm even having kind of a memory come up too. I remember my mom watching soap operas. And I remember being like so enthralled by the kissing parts. And I was like 5 years old and I knew it was wrong. So I also suspect I don't have any memories of this, but my uncle was the youngest in the family. My grandparents were like kind of aloof. So my mom and dad had him a lot. So I think he was alone with me a lot. I actually don't know what my memory is, my first memory of it. I think it was the first time it happened to my cousin. But there's also, I have like this memory of like almost being like, come on, it's okay to do this, like with her, which is really heavy, obviously, to hold. So I think when my aunt came, I think I just already knew it was wrong and it shouldn't have happened. And if I go back to the memory I do have, I remember thinking it's wrong and it shouldn't happen. And I don't know exactly where I would have learned that.
Yeah.
But just in, I think, general and culturally, right? My mom, I don't ever remember my mom having conversations with me like I have with my children about your body and who's allowed to touch your body. And I think when we don't know our bodies, it makes sense that this stuff happens, and you feel, and you were like, oh, no one's ever talked to me about it. I'm not allowed to say. And I think I was also, another part of this culture is deceit and not being truthful about things. And I think that even came up for me. And I know I was really young, but I remember, I think you're deceitful even at church at a young age. It's like, well, why is your dad not here? You know?
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you feel like you said, like it kind of is a culture of deceit? Like, what does that mean exactly?
I think
outside of your family.
Yeah. I mean, I think like lying is absolutely a survival skill in a high control religion like Mormonism that's policing all of your behaviors, right? Because you don't want to feel the shame associated with those things that you do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so helpful. I mean,
And
terrible, but helpful.
I think that was something that I knew from a very young age. And it's interesting because fast forward to I was 15, I ended up doing a confession with my bishop. So I always lied in those worthiness interviews when I was asked, like, have you done anything inappropriate? Have you kept the law of chastity? Are you morally clean in your thoughts and actions? I absolutely lied in those interviews to get my recommend to go to the temple, right? But what happened when I was 15, I had one of my friends found out that my boyfriend had like touched my boobs or whatever. And I felt a lot of pressure to go make an appointment with my bishop to confess. So then I did confess, and he gave me a punishment of I couldn't take the sacrament for 2 weeks, and I had to read some scriptures. And I remember the first sacrament meeting that I attended where I had to pass the sacrament. And my dad looked at me and he was like, what did you do? And I was flooded with shame. And I said, I am never telling the truth ever again. So, which is valid, right? That shame is so real. So I never ever confessed ever again after that.
Wild. Wow.
And I had a boyfriend. I had lots of boyfriends. I had another boyfriend that confessed to his bishop that we had slept together. And so we were in the same stake. So I know that my bishop knew, but I never got pulled in. I never went and talked about it. And I'm like proud of myself for that because I think that was protective.
One of the questions I was going to ask was just simply like, looking back, how did the religious context really reinforce silent shame and self-blame? And I mean, you really explained a lot of that, but I mean, I just think I just guess it can't be overstated, you know? And so one thing I was curious with some of that though, like even the next day with your aunt, and I realized you were 4, so maybe I don't know if this is even a question that can necessarily be answered, but do you feel, was that a lot of like was it her energy, the shame of your family? Like you could tell like this was a big, heavy, bad thing, and therefore the impulse was to say no? Or was there already this overt understanding of like, this is bad, like I know this is bad? Or was it, does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yes, I think it was what you originally said. Like she came in guns blazing into my house, and she was young. My aunt was very young. She's 5 years younger than my mom. She had her first baby at 16, right? And her spouse at the time was like 5 years older than her. So she's also like a victim herself, which I don't know my aunt's history well enough to know. But so it was like very much a charged situation. And my protection was to say no, like this didn't happen. And so I think it was that more than the religion part of it.
That's fair.
Yeah.
But I would say collectively, though, as women in my family, on my mom's side of the family, there was already that sexual abuse related to purity culture, right? Where we were already ashamed of our body parts and all of that. So even that energy that she brought into the room had the undercurrents of purity culture, I would speculate.
Sure.
Right.
I gotcha. Yeah.
That
does. And I was just curious because that's something that I've seen, well, professionally with folks I work with, but also my own story and my own background. I've noticed that like sometimes it wasn't even so much the overt messaging, because as I think back, I didn't get a lot of explicitly negative messaging about my body, but oh man, the awkwardness, the secrecy, the shame, what we didn't talk about was almost as more powerful than what we did talk about. And so I just was curious if that kind of dynamic played out in your family system as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you said something where like you kind of blamed yourself, like that I was the one who caused this. Like that, I don't know if you remember saying that, you kind of like snuck into the conversation. I think that's true for a lot of people who have experienced sexualized violence. But I'm curious to know, like, could you kind of speak to that? Because I feel like that's very common in the LDS church, in any high control religion, actually, just feeling like I was complicit or I caused this, I made this happen. What would you say to somebody who believes that, like, I was complicit or I made this happen because of all of this purity culture, high control religion stuff?
I think, well, the first thing that comes up for me is like, it makes sense that you would feel that way because you're a part of a culture that essentially teaches that, right? I grew up being told like it's always like the men are never at fault. It's always, what were you doing? What were you wearing? How did you interact with them? You're slutty, all of that. So I think so of course you have this shame. And also too, I think as a kid, and I don't remember this, but right in my therapist brain and my own processing, I was still around my uncle all the time. You guys, like, how did I know? You know what I mean? Like, how you're allowed to be around someone who's violated you? And granted, I said no, that he didn't. But like, as a parent, how are you still allowing your kid around that person, right?
Because
And so
he did it to at least one other person, right? Like, so why were your parents letting you be around him?
Why was it okay, right? And so I think that was probably an unconscious thing in my system all the time. So I would say I would first start by saying, like, it makes sense that you feel that way. I think we're conditioned to feel that way. And also, it was never your fault. It was never my fault. I should have never been in that situation. He should have never been in that situation, right? And I think taking that power back and also understanding why it happened has been really healing for me. And part of it did happen because of Mormonism. And I know maybe that sounds crazy and like I'm blaming a religion, but my uncle grew up in the same culture I grew up. I'm pretty confident he's also a sexual abuse survivor in the same way. He didn't have parental supervision. He didn't understand his body. He was left alone with 2 little girls. He's going through puberty. I understand why it happened, And I think that has been really healing for me. And even though I have all that understanding, it still should have never happened and he still should have never done it. And it was never my fault.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think as survivors, we need to hear that more because we don't believe it for a long time.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying that. That's really helpful.
I think I've also been able to say that too, right? Because like I said, I have like a pretty promiscuous sexual history and like hating myself for that and blaming myself for that, but being able to realize like this was just me trying to survive and trying to understand my trauma and what happened. I think also the layer too of I was also growing up in a culture that was like, you can't do any of those things. And I was like, but I want to do all of those things, right? It's like your chocolate cake example that you give all the time. So I was like, I was already like more like hypersexual. And then I was like, no, you can't do any of those things though.
Yeah.
So then I was like extra wanting it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm just thinking too, like the immense amount of pressure that I'm like an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, like having all of this, like essentially like sexual frustration, like not really knowing how to manage what's happening in your body at like 8 years old or 10 years old or 12 years old, when none of your peers really are even able to connect to you on that level, right? At least as a teenager, we're kind of all going through the same things. And that's even taught in school, puberty hits and all the teenagers run wild. But like, that is, I mean, at 8 years old, that's such a heavy burden to be carrying.
For sure. Yeah. And I mean, that's why I think I love my Barbie dolls. Like I would literally play and have like these elaborate things with them and it was safe, which thankfully I had the outlet,
Yeah. Like your body resolving it. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
I know we're going to talk more about this as like nervous system stuff, embodiment stuff. And I love that. I want to ask first though, just in the context of leaving Mormonism, what was that process like? And I mean, I'm curious too, just more specifically, like for you specifically, was there a singular moment or was this like a long drawn out process?
Yeah. So I think it's important to note that I mentioned this earlier, I always tried to be a really good I wanted to be a good Mormon. I wanted to be a believing Mormon. And I never got there. Like, I actually never had a felt sense of belief ever.
Mm.
I wanted to, like, I desperately wanted it, but I never had the testimony that I would say a lot of people do in the Mormon church. And I think that was also really shameful and a struggle for me. And, also what was going to eventually help me leave because I didn't have that like steadfast belief in this religion.
Mhm.
I think the really cool part about my story is when I was prepping to go to college, my parents had a rule that I had to move out of Cedar City. So I was not allowed to stay in my
Mm.
hometown. There's a college here, but I
Mhm.
wasn't allowed to stay in my hometown. And I could have gone to other schools in Utah. But because my dad's side of the family was very diverse and no one is Mormon on my dad's side of the family, I'm pretty close with one of my aunt and uncle. And my grandma also lived in Southern California at the time, so I spent a lot of time going to Southern California. So when I was applying to schools, I applied to college I applied to a bunch of schools in Southern California also. And I ended up getting into a Catholic university in Los Angeles called Loyola Marymount University. It's a small school near the airport. And
Mhm.
my parents, financially at that time, it was before the crash in 2008, were like, okay, you can go. And
Mm.
so when I was 18, I moved to Los Angeles from like tiny, small town Utah. And that shifted the trajectory of my life
Mm.
because I was already a very curious and open person. I was always curious and open about people who were not following the Mormon rules. And I would say I did a lot more experimenting my senior year. Like I went to a couple parties and had a couple drinks. So like I kind of had dabbled in that. And so when I went to
Mhm.
college and I made friends with people, like no one I went to college with was Mormon. I knew one Mormon and the rest were like, it was just so diverse. And my best friend, my college roommate, she was from Las Vegas, just like this spicy, outspoken, strong, independent woman. And she just loved me for me. And I think it was the first time in my life that I felt unconditional love. Like,
That's
like it
awesome.
didn't matter what I wore. It didn't matter what I did on the weekends. It didn't matter what boys I kissed. Like, so I just
Yes.
felt loved. And it allowed me to step out of my comfort zone. And my friends in college loved that I was Mormon, but they knew I was like a bad Mormon, right? Like I
Yeah.
I hooked up with boys, so it was like a fun joke. But I would say I was still fighting so hard my freshman
Mm.
year of college to be like here, but also I'm still clinging to this old identity, which is so like on brand for our developmental
Yes.
stages. But I went to a party my freshman year of college in Utah, and I met a guy who was Mormon and he was a returned missionary, but he was drinking at the party, so I thought I could date him. And we were dating, and I was going to come home after my freshman year of college to get married. I was going to come home and get married. And I had really, like I said, I had really good friends. And one of my best guy friends who actually ended up marrying my now husband and I remember we were on a run and then he was like, "You're not going home and getting married. That like people don't do that. Normal people don't go home and get like
Mm.
leave this school and like, drop this opportunity." And my parents weren't supportive of it. My parents didn't want me to come home and get married.
Yeah.
And so I didn't. I stayed. And my sophomore year, I was really questioning the church because what would happen is I would like party on the weekends and have fun, and then I'd feel so much immense guilt on Sunday. I read
Yeah.
the Book of Mormon my sophomore year of college. I read the Book of Mormon cover to cover, the whole thing. Like I was still trying so hard. I remember in my dorm room listening to General Conference. Like I would go to singles ward. I was really trying hard, and I was for this guy because he
Mm.
wanted to get married at the temple. He was a returned missionary. And I just couldn't do it. Like I could not do it. And then Prop 8 happened in California. When it didn't pass, I got a email from the ward that I was in wanting to have a celebration for Prop 8 not being passed, about all these people's pain, essentially. And I had
Yeah.
a girl in my class with two dads. And I remember thinking about her and like, I cannot, no, this isn't okay. I wasn't okay with it.
Yeah.
And that was the end for me. I think I needed something to be like, not going back. And I never went to church again after that. And I was
Wow.
20 years old. I think there was a lot of circumstances that led me to that point, right? One, moving to Utah. If I wouldn't have left Utah, I'm going to tell you right now, I would be married and I would have a bunch of kids and I would still be struggling with all of this. And actually
Yeah.
makes me emotional. And I think that's why I see myself in a lot of my clients sometimes because like that could have been me, but
Yeah.
fortunately I had a lot of privilege. That's
Mm.
what I'll say. I had a lot of privilege to leave and get out. And I'm so thankful for that. And so I think when I left and I stopped going, that's when I finally got to do some deep work. And I don't think it was until I left, actually, that I told my friend about my sexual abuse. Like, it
Oh,
wasn't, I
wow.
was no longer
Yeah.
attending church anymore. And like,
Yeah.
what ties that I told her. So kind
Yeah.
of a long story, but that's how I stepped away.
No, I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's fabulous. And I feel like, okay, so I worked a lot with domestic violence in the past and well, and even to this day. But in my experience with clients, even in my own story, it's like there is always one moment that happens that like you can't unsee. And it's maybe relatively not even quote unquote that big as compared to everything else. But it like just hits you and you're like, oh my gosh, I cannot unsee this. I cannot be in this relationship or this religion any longer. And it still might take you time to get out of it, but it becomes this like anchor of like things are changing. Like I can't go back to that. So I can really appreciate like you were having these little moments and then all of a sudden this thing comes in. It's like, yep, it's just we can't pass go anymore. Like we just have to start asking questions down this different road and start traveling. What was that like for you, especially now, having as much training as you do and understanding the nervous system, even looking back, how did your body respond to those shifts?
I think it opened up a lot for me. And I'm going to still be straight up with you. I struggled for several years
Oh yeah,
after,
for sure. For sure.
like unpacking this, but I think I started to feel more free. I remember I traveled abroad to Ireland and between my junior and senior year of college. And I just remember I was in a spirituality or a world religions class, and I was learning about all types of things and going to this place. It was like Buddhism, and we went to this like special sacred garden in Ireland, and I was just like, this is so beautiful, and this is what spirituality could feel like. So I think I started to have moments like that of the world and spirituality is so much bigger than what religion had confined it to be. And I was obviously, again, a very open and curious, compassionate person. So I loved people's stories, and I was going to school with all of these people from different walks of life. And then my entire family on my dad's side is not Mormon, and they're great, incredible people. So I just was like, it almost allowed me to embrace them deeper, but I didn't realize I wasn't embracing them fully either at the time. But now I see that. And even I think my friendships and my relationships with my friends in college, I was allowed to like really hold them closer,
Yeah.
And so that's what I would say was the biggest shift is the shame was still very present, but there was a little more freedom.
Yeah. Did you get pushback like from your mom and especially that side of the family?
By that point, neither one of my parents were active, and they hadn't been following the rules for a very long time. The only time my mom had a little bit of feelings was when I had my records removed from the church, which was like 2 years later. And no, 4 years later. And she was like, I just don't know why you need to do that. But my mom was still kind of like that belief, kind of like my grandma, right? She's in a much different place now, but I think she was still like, but this is how we're gonna be together forever. That was the only time she had a little bit of feelings, but everyone was supportive of me. No one was going to church. My brothers weren't going to church. Like we were pretty much on the outs for sure. So I'm really lucky in that regard too, because that's very unique. Most people who leave high control religion don't have family support whatsoever, right? So I also recognize that. And when I say like my exit from Mormonism was very privileged, I also mean it in that regard too. I had a lot of family support and friends and opportunities and community and support system that allowed me to step away. And if I hadn't had that, would I have been able to step away? I don't know.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I'm curious as well, because you did mention just a moment ago about like that you did still, even after you left, you still struggled for a few years. And on to that note, I am interested just to hear what were some of the first signs that you recognized that healing did need to include more than like just talk therapy, for example, or just deconstruction.
Yeah, I think because purity culture was still had its like claws in me.
Yeah.
And I would say especially, right, you have alcohol in the mix too now. And I was still like, my identity was still like, I need a man to love me because I need to be like, that's still my purpose. Even though I'm not Mormon, that's still my purpose. And so I would continue to get myself in really precarious situations with men and do things sexually. And I was consenting to most of them, but then I would feel a lot of shame afterwards. And I got into a relationship my senior year of college with my first non-Mormon boyfriend. Actually, I only have love in my heart for him. He was very emotionally abusive, but I think he represented something for me that like I really needed to have. And so in dating him and like having like a normal, like it's not even normal because he was emotionally abusive, but it was the most normal relationship I had in terms of dating and having sex, right? Where like, because my boyfriend before was Mormon and we did sexual things, but you weren't supposed to do them. So there was always a layer of shame. So it was my first relationship where I got to be more sexually free. And that was really supportive. I don't think I actually realized that I needed deeper therapy until I went to graduate school. And I remember my very, like, right in your last year of graduate school, you start to see clients, you do field work. And I remember sitting across from my client. She was like 9 years old. Like, it was a sexual trauma client, of course, like, go figure. And I remember sitting there and like, I cannot do this if I don't get into therapy myself. And I had kind of dabbled in some talk therapy prior. And so then I started doing more internal work. And I read The Gifts of Imperfection by Brene Brown. And that was the first time I got the language for shame and guilt. And so I started understanding my internal world more. And I think also I had like broken up with this boyfriend and I was again just like doing my own inner work and I was dating and I was having fun. And then I met my now husband and that was like very healing for me. And I'll be really straight up with you. I did not start nervous system work till I moved back to Utah because when I met my husband in 2012, I was really pretty regulated and I had left Mormonism behind and I didn't think that any of this stuff still lived in me anymore. And that relationship was so incredibly healing with me, like especially in the purity culture realm. I mean, just so much sexual safety and exploration and curiosity that had I never moved back to Utah and had babies, maybe I wouldn't have done more deeper work related to purity culture. But so that happened. But then when I did move to Utah after my first baby, I started to have a lot of activation around intimacy and sex. And then after my second baby, I got really bad postpartum depression. And that's how I started doing nervous system work. And that's how I've uncovered all of the purity culture that lives in my system, which it makes a lot of sense that it didn't happen till after I had babies, right? To that trauma, that region of the body. And that's what's allowed me to even target my sexual abuse in a deeper way. It all just came to a head after I had kids. And so and I think also moving back to the environment. When I was in California, I was not around it at all. Like, no, I was not receiving any purity culture messages. Everyone was like, go have fun, be you, right? Live in your body. I had no shame in this relationship I was having. And so if I wouldn't have come back to Utah, I don't know if that all would have flared up again.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. Well, I know, and we've talked so many times too, like, aside from the podcast, of just like that embodied fundamentalism, like how, like you said, you left the church, like you even had your records removed, but you were still seeing ways that purity culture was like in your body and in your relationships and in how you responded to things. And I feel like that is such a common theme for people. We can cognitively deconstruct, but unless we address and resolve how that lives in our body, it just continues on in all of these different ways. And so, kind of moving into some of your professional work with that and tying in your story, how did you kind of first come to understand the role of the body in healing religious trauma and sexual shame, like, and getting you to the place of where you're at now, being a certified brain spotting therapist?
Absolutely. And I think I also want to say, because I was saying like, oh, it was like rainbows and butterflies when I was dating my now husband. Now from my nervous system lens, I could be like, well, there was still some purity culture pieces there, right? Like, so I want to also own that. Like, I was not whole and healed when I thought I was whole and healed. Yeah. But I think, in doing nervous system work, so when I opened a practice in Utah, I had no intention in specializing in religious trauma or purity culture. That was not my niche. I wanted to specialize in trauma. I had found this body-based approach that I was doing to work through my own trauma, distress in my own life, right? And I had done talk therapy for years, and I started doing brain spotting, and it was a night and day difference. And I said, okay, because I was actually really jaded. I'm not gonna lie. In the field, I didn't want to be a therapist anymore because I was just doing talk therapy. And then when I got trained in brain spotting and I started doing brain spotting work with clients, I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is what I've always been meant to do. And it allowed me to come back to my own body. I think one way we survive so much of trauma is to not be embodied anymore and to start to get in contact with my own body and understand my own physiology and the way that trauma lived within myself. I think kind of set the foundation for the next phase of my career. And I think I also subconsciously knew that in order to open a practice in Utah, I needed to have a body-based approach to therapy because of the trauma, because of the religious trauma element. And I knew that mental health was being impacted by the religion. I just don't think I expected it to be what it was. And so then I started working with clients, and I was seeing clients, right? People were coming to see me for all different types of things like anxiety, depression, relationship stuff. And when you do brain spotting, you work with the nervous system and the neurophysiology, and it'll take you to the root cause of a lot of the trauma and distress. And what kept coming up was purity culture, worthiness interviews, LDS, like doctrine experiences, right? And so then I was like, oh my goodness, this is the only way that we're going to address this is through the body because it all lives there. And then I think it also brought up my own religious trauma too, of like, oh wait, I still have it within me. It still lives within me. And what we know, like talk therapy is insufficient. Trauma lives in the body, and you have to have a body-based approach to go in and get it. And I think this was doing my own work allowed me to have the felt sense of what that meant. Right. And also in graduate school, we didn't learn about trauma a lot, and we didn't learn about body-based approach. And so while I had worked with a lot of trauma, I was only doing talk therapy prior to this. And so I think it became very evident for myself personally that this was the next step in treatment.
I just appreciate you sharing all of that. I mean, I've had a similar experience myself professionally, like just all of everything you've been saying. I didn't even get into realizing the depth of how much body-based approaches are necessary until I was done with grad school. And yeah, you're right. Trauma is not talked about. It's talked about, but not talked about like what are actually effective ways to work with it, because CBT is not it, but that was what most of us were trained in. CBT and solution focused, right? Or something like that. Motivational interviewing, like that's not really helpful in this case. So yeah, I just appreciate you sharing that. And it resonates a lot with me as well. I want to hear your take on this because, we talk about the body remembering trauma, remembering things. Of course, now like the name of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, you hear people just make that quip like an everyday conversation now, so a lot of folks understand that. But what are some ways that you would say the body does remember purity culture and like childhood sexual abuse, even long after leaving those systems?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a great question. And I think it can look different for every person, right? Because everybody's neurophysiology remembers differently. But I think, it remembers in a lot of different ways. I'll speak to some of like the purity stuff that came up for me. I would get really activated when my husband would try to initiate sexual activity, and I would just I would get angry and feel pressure to have sex with him, even though that's not what he was doing. And I had this realization in my body that it's because he could ask for pleasure, and I never felt like that's not something you're ever allowed to do. And so like it remembers in that way. I think, I think especially for so many women, and I work with a lot of women on this, is like, especially women that are in their childbearing years, we carry like our psoas muscle is said to be our trauma muscle, right? It constricts when we're in fight or flight. And so we carry all of that in our hips. And I have a lot of women that when they're pregnant, it's like all of this purity culture stuff starts to show up. Like they're questioning the clothing that they're wearing. They're questioning their sexuality. Like all of this stuff flares up. And I think it's because, that region of the body is being activated because you're growing a baby in there. And also it holds a lot of those purity messages because that is the region of the body that they're talking about, right? So I think that's one way it also really shows up. I would say just disembodiment is a huge piece that I witnessed within myself, but with so many clients, right? Because if we're outside of our body, then we're not having to feel the shame and the distress that comes with being in our body. And I think also too, like, again, just to give another example, like I carry all of my activation in my stomach. So I have a ton of stomach issues and historically I've had a ton of stomach issues from like bloating to stomach aches, not being able to eat certain foods. And from doing so much brain spotting and nervous system work, night and day difference in my stomach issues.
Yeah.
Like, so a lot of times when I'm in my processing somatically, I will burp the entire time. And it's like those muscles are releasing. They're releasing all of the, like, they, right. When we are in distress, we bear down. And that's not just in our like body, like our muscles, it's in our fascia. It goes like so deep toward our internal organs. And so like just releasing it. But I think for a lot of people, it's not going to be that explicit. It's going to be like feeling anxious or insecure in your own body, not being able to put a certain shirt on because you don't want to show certain skin. It's going to look different for every person. But I would say activation is when you just feel some type of way in your body and you feel off. And could that be related to purity culture? I think it could, depending on what it is,
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much that's all tied together. It's like, yeah, which came first, the chicken or the egg, that sort of thing. It's just, it's all connected. I know you mentioned obviously brain spotting, nervous system work has been a huge shift for you in your own healing journey. But what would you say have been some of the other kind of powerful moments or turning points for you that have been really helpful as you've healed from both religious trauma, including purity culture, as well as childhood sexual abuse?
I mean, the first thing that comes up for me is my partner. Like I have a very supportive husband who, again, like he loves me so unconditionally and is such a safe space that I've been able to. He was actually the first person that I ever told about my sexual history with and told honestly. And just to have him, especially as a man in this culture, right, where women are not supposed to have lots of sexual partners, for his ability to hold space and not judge me for that and love me for that was really, really powerful. I think that I'm also like, so movement, I would say, is like my spirituality. I love to move my body, and I teach exercise. I started teaching, it was bar, like with the ballet bar in San Diego, and I like kind of created a community, right? It's kind of like church, right?
Yeah.
You have a bunch of like-minded people coming together. And I would say I'm not like I don't like to draw or paint, but this is like a creative outlet for me where I find a lot of creativity. And where I live now, a studio opened in 2020, and I teach like a hot sculpt, which is like a yoga sculpt, but it has like Pilates bar in it. And I make all of my own classes and I make all of my own playlists. And that is like just so it's one of my very favorite things that I do. And I've done this since I became a therapist. It was like my outlet since I became a therapist. And I think it's evolved into so much of my healing journey. And now, like, I move almost every day, and I've embraced that movement sometimes as sitting in child's pose,
Yes.
But like that, I would say my husband and movement are my two things that really have been so supportive. And I think the other piece is learning how to be present in the here and now. And that spirituality can genuinely be anything. So it can be like a hug from my kids. It can be going outside and just like feeling the air. It can be like eating my favorite food. And I know that maybe sounds really simple and silly, but I think learning that those things can be really meaningful is so freeing, because you grew up being told that those are all worldly things,
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. It's exciting.
So exciting. It makes life way more fun.
It does. It really does. I always say, like, if you only have one life to live, like, why not enjoy it and like be present for it? Like, what else are we going to do? Right.
Oh, yeah, seriously. Well, as we're starting to wrap up now, I do have one question. We always ask our guests some variation of this question. And that is, if you could go back and speak to your younger self, what would you say to her? And not just with words, but in tone or in body?
This is like already like bringing up some emotions. I think that there, like, little me always envisioned this life that I have now. Like, I think she always like, and she always, because that's what she never believed. Like, she always knew that something bigger was out there. And I think I would just go back and say, like, we get there. I know we get there. And I know this is really hard and this is really scary, but keep going, keep trusting yourself. We're going to get there. And that's what I would say to her, because she always knew. And like, maybe that sounds like really woo woo, but I swear there was always a part of me that knew this would be it, you know?
I love that.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to get emotional.
No, that's okay. I mean, we've talked about this before, but I felt similarly where like there was always that part of me that was like, this isn't all it's cracked up to be. You know, like this thing, it feels like an illusion more than it does like real or true or things like that. And there's a lot of times along the way where I had to suppress that part of me. But yeah, just like that little version of ourselves, we always knew that there's something more. And we could trust it. So I love that you have that.
Yeah.
So, you know, I know we're going to get more into purity culture in Mormonism, you know, the system specifics, healing, all of that stuff in the next episode. But as we wrap up this episode today, what do you want other survivors of childhood sexual abuse who are maybe raised in a high control religion to know about healing?
The first thing that comes up for me is that it is absolutely possible. I will say that I also think it is a journey. And it's not a destination. And I think that applies to all types of healing, right? I don't know if we're ever quote unquote healed, because I don't know if that's realistic. But one, that you're not alone, that it wasn't your fault. And there are people out there who do believe you and can help you navigate this. And I think for me, right, finding someone I could tell that did believe me was such a huge catalyst to my own journey. And then, you know, 10 or so years later, doing some really intense nervous system, body-based work truly changed my life. And I don't think you have to start there, but I am a firm believer that shame gets quieter when we share it in safe spaces, and finding one safe person to start sharing your story with, I think that is the place I would really invite someone to start.
That is beautiful. Yeah. There's so much power in that. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's like Queen Brene Brown talks about like the antidote to shame is empathy, you know, because shame is so isolating. And so to like, just let somebody else like tiptoe in and say like, I'm here with you is so important. They don't even have to have gone through like the same experiences. It's just that you are not alone. There is somebody else here with you is so powerful. So what a perfect note to kind of like wrap things up. And you know, we'll make sure, you know, this will be at the end of at both episodes, but if people want to get in touch with you, follow your work, maybe even work with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, so the best way to connect with me, you can either connect with me on Instagram, which is AshleyB_therapy, and I have my website linked there, or you can do my website, which is ashleybuckner.lmft.com, and there's a contact form there to work with me. I also share a lot of things on Instagram, personally and professionally, so that's a great community to connect with me on.
Yes. Highly recommend following Ashley if you don't already. Even if you did not grow up in the Mormon church, I think you should follow, because I feel like so much of, I mean, high control religion is high control religion. It's not like they have a different playbook, you know, for every denomination. We have 3 denominations represented here today, and somehow we have like extremely similar experiences across the board. So even if you didn't grow up in the Mormon church, follow Ashley, because she puts out really great content, and you'll learn a lot too about the Mormon church. So it's pretty fun. But we'll make sure to link all of that in the show notes today. Ashley, it's been so wonderful to have you here. I'm excited for people to hear the next episode as well. But thank you for sharing your own story and your own like experience inside the church, moving out of it, and really being in this like journey of healing every day. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you both for holding space. It was lovely.
Thank you once again to Ashley Buckner for coming on the Sunday School Dropouts podcast. If you are wanting to get in touch with Ashley, make sure to head to the show notes and you can find her website, her social medias, and you can follow along with her content or schedule a session with her. And make sure that you stay tuned for next week's episode where we are going to have Ashley back, and she is going to be talking about all sorts of special or unique things that come up within LDS purity culture and how to heal from it. So I think with that, all God's people said, amen.
Amen.